We're going to talk about Stoicism, and that's big S, capital S Stoicism, which refers to the Stoic philosophers. A lot of people, when they say Stoic, they talk about small s Stoicism, which is kind of that stiff upper lip. And some people think that the Stoics, I better start my stopwatch, actually. Some people think that the Stoics didn't have any room for enjoyment and fun in their life, and that is absolutely not the case. But I'm going to talk about the use of Stoicism in everyday life and how we can all use it. So first of all, let's talk about a little timeline of the Stoic philosophers. So the founder of Stoicism was Zeno of Citium. And way back in 334 BCE, he was a very wealthy trader. And he traded in dye, in this purple dye. If you've seen the old movies of the Greeks and the Roman royalty, they all wore those purple clothing. So he traded in that dye, which was very expensive stuff. He became very wealthy. And then all of his wealth went into one big, massive shipment that he was shipping across, I think it was the Aegean Sea. And he basically got shipwrecked and lost his entire fortune. Now, fortunately, he managed to survive and made his way to Athens. He was completely penniless, and he was sitting in a bookstore one day and reading a book on philosophy by Socrates. And he asked the bookkeeper, the store manager, he said, "Where can I find such an individual, a philosopher?" And he actually said, "Oh, there's one walking right past now." And it was a cynic. A cynic philosopher. We all know cynicism today. That's from the Cynics. I can't remember his name, but he went and studied under him. Then he also studied deeper into Socrates' philosophy, was heavily influenced by that, studied some other stuff, and then he founded Stoicism. So Stoicism became the prevailing philosophy in ancient Greece, and it was the first ever philosophy that was preached to the masses. So it was preached on the agora in Athens, in the marketplace. And in those days, if you had issues, you went and you listened to the Stoic philosophers actually teaching and talking to the public. So it became very influential throughout Greece and then spread into Rome. Now, what we know is that all of the writings, pretty much all of them from the early and the middle Stoa, they were lost to history, but the Romans took it up, and we know a lot about Stoicism, mainly from the writings of the Romans. So particularly Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius. Who's familiar with any of those? Who's familiar with Marcus Aurelius? I think most people, if you've seen the movie Gladiator, you've seen Marcus Aurelius. He's called the last of the great Roman emperors, and he was also a Stoic philosopher, but he was heavily influenced by Epictetus. And he was taught in turn by Musonius Rufus. So that's the kind of history of it. Now, Stoicism then ran into Christianity. And Christianity actually took on lots of different parts of Stoicism. This whole idea of the Holy Spirit in Christianity actually came from Stoicism and the eudaimon. And they were pagans, but they talked about your best spirit, eudaimon. And it influenced lots of different Christian thought. You know the prayer from Alcoholics Anonymous? That actually came from Stoicism as well. And then it was largely forgotten and then kind of rediscovered in the late 19th century, then sort of got overridden a bit by Freud, but then had a sort of a secret renaissance with CBT. So Ellis and Beck, rational emotive behavior therapy, then cognitive behavior therapy, they actually based a lot of it on Stoicism. So anybody who's done CBT, any CBT practitioners or anybody who's studied it, largely based on Stoic philosophy. And that's actually where I first came into it, studying Stoicism about 15 years, or studying CBT. And I was kind of interested in Stoicism, and then I got very, very interested in Stoicism reading this book by James Stockdale. Anybody familiar with James Stockdale? So he was in the Second World War. He was a fighter pilot in the Second World War. He's a very senior officer. And he got shot down very early in the war. and ended up in a prisoner of war camp called the Hanoi Hilton. Anybody familiar with the Hanoi Hilton? So it was called the Hanoi Hilton. It was a rather ironic nickname given by the inmates because it was the most brutal prison camp in all of Vietnam. Now, Stockdale, because he was the senior officer in there, was singled out for particularly harsh treatment. Stockdale did 7.5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. 4 of those years were spent in solitary confinement. And I think somebody yesterday mentioned solitary confinement. That's the worst thing that you can do to a human being. Stockdale was routinely tortured. For almost 3 of those 4 years in solitary confinement, he was chained up in leg irons. But not only did he manage to survive, but he inspired his fellow prisoners to survive. And John McCain, you guys remember him, the US Senator? Died a couple of years ago, Republican Senator, very famously stood up to Trump. He spent 5 years in the Hanoi Hilton. He went on record to say, he said, if James Stockdale had not been in the Hanoi Hilton, I would not have survived, and many of my friends would not have survived. We owe our lives to James Stockdale. Now, Stockdale talks in this book that when he was shot down, when he ejected, he saw the Viet Cong coming in to get him, and he said to himself, 5 years at least. That's how long I'm going to be here. I'm now leaving my world, the world of technology, and I'm entering into the world of Epictetus. So he was a big fan of Epictetus. He took Epictetus's discourses and Enchiridion to war with him, and he used to read them whenever he got a chance. So basically, he used Stoic philosophy to help him and to help his fellow prisoners to actually get through what was pretty much hell on earth. And so that's a bit of a background around it. Now, central to Stoicism is this whole idea of eudaimonia. The Stoics said that people who chase happiness are fools because happiness is fleeting, it kind of goes up and down. But what is much more enduring is this concept of eudaimonia, of a life of flourishing or fulfillment. And it's basically, again, down to that eudaimon, your best inner spirit and living your best life. And there's kind of 3 sides to the Stoic triangle. And the most important one is living life with arete. So arete roughly translates as good character. And for the Stoics, that was all you needed to live a good life, to know that you were doing right, that you were being your best self in any given moment. They also talked about taking responsibility for your own actions and your own behaviors, but also they took it a further step. They talked about taking responsibility for the hand that fate deals you and not being a victim. The Stoics, particularly Epictetus, says that we are all actors in a play, and we are given roles by the writer of the play, and we must play our given roles well. So basically, it ties into this concept of amor fati, of love of fate. Rather than being a victim, you actually take responsibility for the hand that fate deals you. And that's important because when you take responsibility for something, then you are compelled to act. And linked into this is the third idea of focusing on that which you can control and refusing to invest your energy in the stuff that you can't control. So let's make that real. I'm going to dive into that a little bit more. But who has recently, in the last couple of months, invested their energy in some absolute dickhead? Hands up. How'd that shit work out for you? We talked about the Romans. Was that an awesome investment of your energy or not such a good investment of your energy, right? The Stoics would say the fault lies not with the dickhead, the fault lies with you. They said there are dickheads all around. Well, they didn't have a potty mouth like me, but they said there are challenging people all around us, but if we choose to invest our energy in them, it is a flaw in our character. And I'm going to come into that a little bit later on. But here are the Stoics' 4 cardinal virtues. So they talked a lot about arete, and here were their cardinal virtues. So the first one and most important one is wisdom. That is about knowing how to act, how to be good in any given situation. Marcus Aurelius famously said in his Meditations, stop arguing about what a good man should be and just be one, right? But you need wisdom to do that, right? And that's tied in with this idea of justice, which is better described as social morality. So the Stoics were actually the first people who said that if you treat people differently because of the color of their skin or their gender, then that is a flaw in your character. That was 2,000 years ago. They were talking about that. They also talked a lot about temperance, which we know as moderation, and also courage, which is not absence of fear, but it's acting correctly even in the presence of fear. And I really started to get my arms around Stoicism, particularly reading James Stockdale stuff, because it was largely based on Socrates, who was actually a military person. A lot of people don't realize Socrates was in the military, and a lot of his stuff is about military stuff. So being an ex-military guy, it kind of linked in rather nicely to me. So I want to talk a little bit about the hand of fate. This guy you've seen before, right? So this is Oscar, who not only does cold showers, but I do have to say this because Grant mentioned earlier on, has been doing ice baths for a few years, and I think you'll find our ice bath predated his freezer, right? Just had to get out of the way, a little bit of competition. Now, Oscar is a pretty keen sportsman, pretty good sportsman, two-time Australian karate champion, the youngest kid to have represented Australia in karate. He was also a very good runner, came 13th in the state of Victoria in terms of running, plays highest level soccer, was player of the year. But for us as parents, probably the thing I'm most proud of is that he was also school captain last year and won an award. There's this award in the school that's all about character, right? And you know, we talk a lot in our house about character. And so Oscar coming with that award for us was the kind of proudest thing. Now, you might get the sense that there's a bit of a twist coming. So let's talk about what we call the shit sandwich timeline. So we talk a lot in our household that sometimes the universe just serves you up a shit sandwich to eat. And it's really about how you eat that shit sandwich, right? And so we started realizing something was wrong in September of last year. That this very happy-go-lucky, sporty kid all of a sudden started to withdraw, started to go into this pretty deep depression for no reason whatsoever, right? And we were thinking, is it too much pressure being captain of the soccer team, school captain, all of this sort of stuff? Is it a pressure thing? We talked to him, wasn't about that. He kept saying he didn't feel like a kid anymore. We didn't know what was going on. You know, my wife's a coach, she used ACT and all of this stuff, and none of it seemed to be working. And then when we saw this photograph, that's when I realized that something was up. So this was less than 2 months later than that. And I looked at this photograph and I went, fuck, that's cortisol. Oscar had been complaining about putting on weight. He was such an active kid. And I realized that something was seriously amiss. So we went to the doctor and said, we want to go and see a pediatrician. There's something seriously going on here. Got taken to the pediatrician. Oscar, at the same time as developing this classic moon face that you see in cortisol, started to get hairy. He hadn't gone through puberty, but he got very hairy. His balls hadn't dropped yet. I think that's a medical term, your balls dropping. But that hadn't happened, and I thought there's something really going on here. And also, he had not grown at all since January, right? And so when we went back and checked the height, and we saw that all the other boys were catching up, he was always in the 90th or so percentile in height and just stopped growing. So we took him to the pediatrician. The pediatrician thought that it was just kind of asynchronous puberty, said, let's just watch him wait for 3 months. And I said to the pediatrician, I'm not leaving your office until you agree to test his cortisol. So he tested his cortisol, and it came back as 15 times the upper limit of cortisol. So that's when we realized that something serious was going on. I thought maybe he had glucocorticoid resistance, maybe it was too much exercise or a whole combination of stuff. And this was the 3rd of December. you can see the change. It almost doesn't look like the same kid. We got a referral to see an endocrinologist. It was just in early December. We thought we weren't going to see until after Christmas. I wrote to them, give them all the data that I had on him in terms of height, of not growing, a whole heap of research papers showing cortisol inhibits growth, and just basically pestered them. And we got in, luckily, to see him before Christmas. They did some testing, and they came back to us and said, we think he's got either Cushing's disease or Cushing's syndrome. Anybody familiar with either of those? So they're pretty rare diseases. 1 in a million adults, 1 in 5 to 10 million kids get it. When it's untreated, life expectancy is about 5 years. So, excuse me, it's obviously a pretty serious disease. Now, Cushing's disease is a tumor on the pituitary gland, and Cushing's syndrome is an ectopic tumor, so somewhere else that is hypersecreting cortisol. And so they were running a number of different tests to find out what it was. They thought it was Cushing's disease, which gave us a little bit of relief because the other tumors can be very often they're cancerous as well. So they did a number of tests. They put him in for an MRI scanner, and it showed nothing. So they then said, look, the next test that we need to do is this inferior protrusal sinus sampling. So it's a pretty risky operation. They go through the groin, they go through an artery and go up with guided MRI, stick a probe up to right up into the brain, to the pituitary gland. And the idea is they sample the blood coming out of each side of the pituitary gland so that they can then determine what side of the pituitary the tumor's on to give them a bit of a steer when they go into an operation. Now, it's a very risky operation. There's about a 2% chance of a brainstem injury and becoming paraplegic. So clearly this was not an easy time for us. And then I asked them what MRI they'd done. And they came back with the MRI, and I said, you've done the wrong MRI. I had actually sent them the latest research paper. As you can imagine, I read every single research paper I could on Cushing's disease, and they were supposed to have done a contrast MRI. I had told them that, and they didn't do it. So it's the day before that operation, and I insisted that we had to push really hard, insisted that they redid the MRI. They redid the MRI, and boom, up popped the pituitary, the thing on the pituitary. So this was the day of his operation. He was pretty happy. That's Oscar trying to be happy. Cushing's disease just completely destroys any ability for happiness because it blats out with stress. You know more about this than anybody, Grant, that chronic stress on the brain. And so this was probably, I think, the hardest moment of our lives, having to take Oscar, excuse me. I wasn't quite expecting this one. Having to take him into the operation. And this was also the happiest day of our life when he came out of the operation and immediately cracked a joke. And that was the first joke we'd heard in probably 6 or 8 months. So that was a really great outcome. The issue was that we got no support whatsoever for his mental health, even though I'd sent them research paper after research paper showing that there should be a coordinated approach to Cushing's disease, that the most important thing afterwards was mental health, that there was psychology needed. They eventually brought in a psychiatrist who diagnosed him with anorexia, and I friggin' hit the roof. And you know, it's all about context. The reason she diagnosed him with anorexia was that he lost weight from December to March, and I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But basically, we got no help around his mental health. Fortunately, you know, Stoicism is big in our house. My wife has studied Japanese psychology. She does acceptance commitment therapy. So we just had to manage it ourselves. This was the 15th of March. Then by April, you see a pretty dramatic change in him. And there's in June. So, and the weight just kind of fell off him We had to fight to get him on growth hormone. They didn't want to put him on growth hormone, whereas every single research paper I found said that if they don't go on growth hormone, they'll end up with compromised final height. And all Oscar wanted to do was grow. And once he saw that he was starting to grow, the cloud just lifted, right? And so by the time of his birthday, he's back to being a happy kid. Now, I want to talk about some of the stuff that we actually used to help us get through. So this whole idea of zone 1 and zone 2, focusing on what you can control. Epictetus said that everything in your life is in 2 zones, zone 1 and zone 2. Zone 1, according to Epictetus, is the stuff that is within your will or within your power. And everything else is zone 2. And he says you must focus on that which you can control and refuse to invest your energy in that which you can't control. So in our household, we all identified what was actually going to be zone 1. So for Oscar, he wrote down 3 things that he could control. And he asked me about Cushing's disease. He said, Dad, you need to tell me everything about Cushing's disease, because if you don't, I'll look it up on Dr. Google. And he said, and that will give me half nonsense, half good stuff, so you tell me what you know. And he said, why did people gain weight? And I said, well, Cushing's disease increases your appetite. It also reduces your metabolism. And he said, well, doesn't exercise increase your metabolism? And I said, yes. So Oscar wrote down the things that he could control were the amount of exercise he did, his nutrition, and his attitude. How he actually chose to react to his circumstances. He took to diary, journaling every single night. In December and January, I took time off. Oscar did about 30,000 steps a day on average. He came up with the idea that we would need to redo our entire backyard, which was quite big. We ended up, by late December and early January, me and Oscar shifted about 7 tons of stone out there. He was working 8-hour days, and I was quite happy with it because he was just given a project that he could actually focus on to manage some stuff. He also was counting calories. I wasn't happy about it, but anytime I talked to him about it, he got quite stressed. So we let it go because I realized he needed autonomy in that. And he was determined to be the first ever Cushing's patient to lose weight, which he was. And so he lost weight, and they thought he was an anorexic. And then Carly's one was about being his rock and being his coach, and using a combination of ACT and Japanese psychology to help him get through. For me, it was about being his best mate. He didn't want to see any of his friends. He kind of socially withdrew, so we just spent a shitload of time together, playing sport, working in the garden, all of this sort of stuff. But also, for me, it was about being a researcher to find out, what can we do here, and being the biggest pain in the ass that I could be for the medical people, which I continue to be, right? So the other thing that was really, really important was Stockdale's whole idea of a mission. He realized in that prison camp that these guys needed a mission, and he talked to them about returning with honor. So this was all about arete. He talked about the Korean War, where the officers and men turned on each other, and he said they came home, but they had no honor intact. And so we created a mission around this, and Oscar wanted to be the best damn person he could be. But also, we used the Stockdale paradox. The Stockdale paradox, when you're facing huge challenges, and this is based on Stoic philosophy, is that you have to retain the faith that you will prevail in the end, no matter what your circumstances. And at the same time, you need to confront the most brutal aspects of your reality, whatever they might be. So we didn't sugarcoat this stuff with Oscar. We told him it was going to be really hard. He knew what was lying ahead of him. But we said, mate, we will get through this. We will get through this together. And that really helped us to get through. The other thing that really helped was this whole idea of the Stoic stage. So we're doing a little thought experiment. And I'm just going to get you guys to do it with you, because I think understanding it is really important. So let's just do this thought experiment. So this is you, normal, everyday, run-of-the-mill you. And now I need to talk about the voices in your head. You guys know what I'm talking about? Now, I know some people have got a shitload of voices in their head, but we just need to talk about the two polarizing extremes, right? So put your hand up if you can relate to a version of you that's just a little bit shit. Anybody? Cool. Everybody who's not a sociopath or a narcissist has their hands up, right? This is what I call your inner gremlin, right? And it's driven by this sort of stuff. Negative self-talk, overthinking, worry, anxiety, a victim mentality, self-criticism, anger, desire, all of this sort of stuff. And most people would love to get rid of their gremlin, right? And there are approaches in psychology that try to help you do that. It's kind of that psychoanalytical, Freudian-based psychology. Come in, lie down on the couch, let's talk about your childhood, how you got fucked up, and we'll put you back together, right? And it can be really helpful for some people. It takes a long time, but it can also screw some other people up, right? The approach that's taken by 3 different modalities is a very different approach. I call it an accelerator approach. It's Stoicism, acceptance commitment therapy, and Japanese psychology, which Carly is experts in the literature too. They say it's not about getting rid of your gremlin because you can't, right? It's about how much attention you pay to your gremlin. That's the key thing. So we talked a lot. Oscar created a gremlin in seeds. We all did created a gremlin in seeds. And in Japanese psychology, they say that when you're struggling, the most important thing under your control is the flashlight of your attention. And as a neuroscientist, I love that expression because whatever you pay attention to, your brain will commit cells to it. So when you pay attention to your gremlin, you're feeding mogwai after midnight. And if you know what that means, you're showing your age, right? So the Stoics said you should consult your inner sage in times of difficulties. And it's you close this gap by zonal thinking. What is zone 1? What is zone 2? Regular gratitude, mental rehearsal when you've created your sage. I'll talk about that in a second. Positive bias, but more importantly, positive action. Acceptance commitment therapy. You accept you've just been given a shit sandwich and you're having negative emotions, but you commit to action that is in accordance with your values that will take you towards the person you want to be. And in Japanese psychology, there's a beautiful term called arugamama. With things as they are, what needs to be done? And so that really became the focus in our household. And so here, I will send you a link to doing this. You fill out your character strengths and name and all of this sort of stuff, values and virtues, which is really helpful. But here's Oscar's version. So his inner sage was called Flash, and his gremlin was called Derek. Now, look at the big dark cloud over Derek's head, right? But it's what he's saying that blew me away. He's saying, I will crush the good ones, and I will be the king of Oscar's head. What calls that shit? Sometimes they're very insightful little kids, right? So that it is when you pay attention to the negative self-talk, it becomes the king of your head. If you choose to pay attention to it, that is the key thing. My inner sage is called Jev, named after these 3 guys: J for James Stockdale, E for Epictetus, and V for Viktor Frankl, whose book I read as a 17-year-old, and it had a profound impact on my life. And the amount of times that I had to ask myself, what would Jev do right now? But that question was so helpful. The other question you can ask yourself when you write down your character strengths of your sage is, what actions would I take right now to express those characteristics? Note the way that both of those questions are action-focused. Arugamama, with things as they are, what needs to be done? And so the last little thing I want to talk about from the Stoics that was really useful for me was Memento mori. And I got this from Marcus Aurelius. And he said to himself, Marcus, Memento mori, remember that you are mortal, that you could die at any moment. And he says, remember that, Marcus, not to be morose, but to remind yourself that life is a precious gift and that you should wake up every single day with extreme gratitude just to be alive. And you should use that thought, memento mori, to judge your behaviors and your actions that day. Seneca took it a step further, which was very relevant for me. He said, when you put your kids to bed at night, kiss them good night and remind yourself that they could die at any moment. And do that not to be morose, but to remind yourself of the stuff that is very precious to you and where you should spend your time and your energy. And that Memento Mori had such an impact on me that it's no longer written on my bathroom mirror, because the day after Oscar's operation, I got it inked on me forever. So that every single day, I have that reminder, not just of my impermanence, but also of my kids, because it helps you to focus on the stuff that is actually important. So this was my wife sent me this morning. She heard a shout and groans downstairs and ran down, and Oscar's like that. So you can see that his sense of humor is well and truly back. But the journey is not over. I was telling a couple of people last night that Oscar has suffered from severe myopathy. Nobody really knows what's going on, but his exercise capacity has gone back to what it was when he was a 7-year-old. And it's pretty hard for a little kid whose identity is so wrapped up in sport. But we keep focusing on the stuff that we can control. We talk a lot in our house about silver linings. And Oscar has been talking about how good the silver lining will be when he gets back and he can beat his best mate from the soccer team, Lewis, in a sprint again. Because Oscar used to be the fastest in the team. He's now the slowest, but he's just focused on getting there. But he said the biggest silver lining for him is that I can no longer say to him that he's brought up in a bubble within a bubble within a bubble, as I do. He said, Dad, you may have been brought up in Belfast, but you never had Cushing's disease, you ponce. And so, guys, that is that from me. Thank you. Take a photo of that. If you've got a phone, I will send it up. That is a link to a hidden page on my website. There's lots of other resources. There's an 8-minute workout. You can download the Sage and Gremlin exercise and some other stuff. So I've now got to run to the airport. I'd just like to say thank you, a big thank you to all of you guys. I love coming over here, but massive thank you to both Grant and Louise for the stuff that you're doing. You may not change the world, but you're definitely going to change New Zealand, and I'm just delighted to have a very small part in that. Thank you.